Frank Sinatra's hand closed around the microphone at 9:47 in the evening, and in the half-second before Dean Martin registered what was happening, the Copa Room went so quiet that you could hear a woman in the third row set her champagne flute down on the tablecloth without making a sound. Nobody breathed. The orchestra had been mid-phrase, something warm and unhurried, and then the conductor's baton simply stopped, suspended in air, like a question nobody wanted to answer. Dean stood there with the microphone, half pulled from his grip, and his smile still on his face. And the smile was the most extraordinary thing anyone in that room had ever seen, because it hadn't changed at all, not even slightly, not even around the edges, where smiles always fail first. Wait, because what happened in the next 90 seconds would be repeated in whispered conversations across Las Vegas for the better part of a decade, and almost nobody who told the story understood what it had actually cost the man standing there with that immovable smile on his face. The date was a Thursday in the autumn of 1965, and the Sands Hotel Copa Room held 400 people on a full night, which that night it was. Tables ran close together as they did in every great showroom of that era. White linen against white linen, cigarette smoke already layered beneath the chandeliers. By 9 o'clock, the whole room a low, warm gold from the stage lights bouncing off brass fixtures along the walls. Dean had been on for 22 minutes. He was in good voice. Not that he ever acknowledged such a thing, the way some performers did. He simply sang, the way a man might lean against a doorframe and talk to someone he liked, easy and unhurried. He had been 3 bars into a ballad, his right hand making that slow half-circle it sometimes did, as if conducting the room toward some understanding only he could see. And then Frank came out of the wings. Stop for a moment and picture the room from above, because it matters where everyone was sitting. The Copa Room's VIP tables ran in an arc closest to the stage. At a table perhaps 15 feet from the left edge, a man named Victor Mancuso sat with 3 others who had not been introduced by name to the waitstaff. Mancuso had interests in 2 of the Sands' ancillary operations and a financial relationship with hotel management, never committed to paper. He had seen Dean Martin perform 11 times. He had never once come to see Frank Sinatra. This detail, small and apparently irrelevant at 9:47 on a Thursday, would matter very much by midnight. At a table, slightly further back, sat a woman named Estelle Carver, a former singer who had spent 12 years in rooms considerably smaller than this one, before her voice gave out, and she began giving lessons in the San Fernando Valley. She had the quality of attention that former performers carry into audiences, a fine-grained alertness to what is actually happening on a stage versus what is merely appearing to happen. She would be one of the more reliable witnesses to that evening's events, because she had been watching not the drama of it but the craft beneath the surface. Frank came from stage left. He was wearing his tuxedo. Frank always dressed. But the jacket was not quite right on his shoulders, in the way that happens when a man has been sitting a long time and stands up suddenly. His hair was perfect. It was always perfect. He crossed the stage in 7 steps. On the 4th step, he reached out his right hand and closed it around Dean's microphone. Dean's singing simply stopped, not cut off, not strangled. It arrived at a silence the way a road arrives at a cliff edge, present and then not present. The orchestra played one more beat. Then the conductor, Harold Tellez, brought the baton down and held it there. The room went into that silence. Dean looked at Frank. Frank looked at Dean. Frank's hand was still on the microphone. Notice something here, because it is the thing that Estelle Carver would talk about for the rest of her life. Dean's free hand, the one not holding the microphone, went into his jacket pocket. Not in a defensive gesture, not reaching for anything, not bracing. It simply went into his pocket, the way a man's hand goes into his pocket when he is standing on a corner waiting for a taxi. As if this were entirely ordinary. as if Frank Sinatra's hand on his microphone in front of 400 people were something that happened on a Thursday and didn't require a particular physical response. "Hallie," Dean said. He said it into the microphone, which meant the room heard it. The room understood from one word that Dean Martin had decided, in whatever fraction of a second these things are decided, that this was going to be managed as a performance rather than a confrontation. The word came out warm and easy, and with exactly the inflection it always had, the one that made it sound less like a word and more like a hand on a shoulder. Frank's grip on the microphone didn't loosen. There was a man at the bar that night, Thomas Ricci, who had come to the Sands, not for the show but for a conversation he needed to have with Victor Mancuso before the end of the week. His position gave him a view not only of the stage, but of the table where Mancuso sat. He would later describe what he saw there as three men becoming very still, the way animals become still when deciding whether something is a threat or merely a novelty. Mancuso himself did not become still. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and watched the stage with an expression Ricci described as patient, the expression of a man who has already calculated how this ends, and is simply waiting for the mathematics to play out. What Thomas Ricci knew, and what very few in that room knew, and what Dean Martin had known for 6 weeks, was that Frank Sinatra owed Victor Mancuso $40,000. Not formally, but in the sense that Mancuso had done a service that had not been acknowledged in the customary way. This had persisted long enough that Mancuso had begun making comments that traveled through certain rooms until they reached the person they were intended for. Those comments had reached Frank 3 days ago. 3 days of knowing this had produced, among other things, a Thursday evening at the Sands, where Frank Sinatra's hand was on Dean Martin's microphone and 400 people were watching. Dean's smile had not moved. "You want to say something to these fine people?" Dean said into the microphone, still warm, still easy, as if he were inviting Frank to join a conversation already in progress, a pleasant conversation about nothing in particular on a Thursday evening. Something shifted in Frank's face. It was not the shift of a man coming back to himself, because he had not entirely left himself. Frank Sinatra was never entirely without calculation, even in his worst moments. It was the shift of a man who has just understood that the landscape has changed, and that the person in front of him has already adjusted to this without making a production of it. Frank's hand came off the microphone. And here is where the story becomes something other than what it appeared to be. Because Dean Martin did not acknowledge that Frank's hand had come off the microphone. He did not glance at the orchestra, or at the conductor, or at the wings, or at the audience in the way a performer glances at an audience when inviting them to share in the acknowledgement of something that just happened. He simply stepped half a step to the left, placing himself at Frank's shoulder rather than opposite him, and said into the microphone, "Ladies and gentlemen, my friend Mr. Frank Sinatra needs no introduction in this room, which is good, because I'm not going to give him one." The room laughed. It was a genuine laugh. The laugh an audience produces when a skilled performer has just shifted the ground beneath their feet, and they are grateful for it, grateful that someone knows how to do this. Harold Tells raised his baton. The orchestra came back in on a different cue, warmer, something that a room could settle into, rather than be startled by. Dean put his arm around Frank's shoulder, briefly, in the way of men who have been standing next to each other in difficult rooms for a long time. Frank. And this is the detail Estelle Carver would describe with the most precision. Frank leaned into it, just slightly, just for a moment. The lean of a man who is very tired and has just been offered something solid to lean against. "He knows every song I know," Dean said, "which is going to make tonight very competitive." Another laugh. "Frank, you want to do one?" What happened over the next 20 minutes has been described by everyone present as one of the finest things they ever witnessed in a showroom. Frank sang 3 songs. Dean stood at the edge of the stage and watched him with the expression of a man genuinely glad to be watching someone he loves do something extraordinary. The orchestra adjusted without instruction, finding Frank's tempo, finding the spaces around his phrasing. At his table, Victor Mancuso uncrossed his legs and ordered another drink. The expression on his face had changed. It was no longer patient. It was something Thomas Ricci found harder to name, something that sat closer to respect. Remember this moment, because what it cost is the part of the story that almost nobody knows. After Frank finished the third song, the room gave him an ovation that went on for a long time. Frank had to do something with his hands and his face. What he did was look at Dean. Dean made a small motion with his chin, part of the private language they had developed over 15 years of standing in rooms together, and Frank nodded once and walked back into the wings. Dean finished his set, 4 more songs, unhurried, nothing in his manner, suggesting that the preceding half-hour had been anything other than a well-planned guest appearance. He took his bow, said goodnight, and the room exhaled the way rooms exhale when they have been held at a certain tension and are finally released. Backstage, in the corridor between the stage and the dressing rooms, a man named Pete Benedetto was waiting outside Dean's dressing room door. Pete Benedetto worked for the Sands in a capacity not specified on any organizational chart, but understood by everyone in the hotel's operational spaces. A compact man of about 50, whose presence in a specific corridor was generally a message from management rather than a coincidence. "Mr. Martin," he said. "Pete," Dean said. "Mr. Entratter would like a word." "Give me 10 minutes," Dean said. Pete Benedetto nodded and did not move from outside the door. Inside the dressing room, Dean sat down in front of the mirror and looked at himself the way performers do after a difficult performance. Not with vanity, but diagnostically. His hands were steady. He had learned over many years that his hands told him things about what was happening inside him that his face and his voice had long since been trained to conceal. Frank appeared in the doorway behind him, reflected in the glass. Dean looked at Frank's reflection. "You want a drink?" Dean said. "No," Frank said. "He too." Dean poured 2 drinks from the bottle on the side table without turning around. He held one out behind him, and Frank's hand came past his shoulder and took it. Frank sat down on the couch along the wall, slightly too small, slightly too soft, the kind of couch that made every man who sat on it look mildly defeated. Frank looked defeated. He was not drunk, or not very drunk, which was perhaps the most complicated part of the evening. A man who does what Frank had done while genuinely intoxicated can be forgiven it easily, filed under the heading of an excess that got the better of him. But Frank Sinatra was mostly sober. They both knew it. "Mancuso," Dean said. "It was not a question." Frank looked at his drink. "Yeah. How much?" 40. Dean drank some of his drink. In the mirror, he could see the back of Frank's head, the perfect hair, the set of shoulders carrying something heavy. "You knew he'd be out there tonight. Someone told me this afternoon. And you thought the best way to handle it was to come out and grab my microphone in front of 400 people. Frank said nothing. In front of 400 people, Dean said again, not louder, just again, including 3 of Mancuso's guys. "I wasn't thinking." "No," Dean said. "You weren't. Listen. Because the silence in that dressing room was of a specific quality. Not the silence of 2 men who have run out of things to say. The silence of 2 men who have been in enough rooms together to know when a thing needs to be sat with before it can be addressed." Outside the door, Pete Benedetto was presumably still standing. Down the corridor, Jack Entratter was presumably waiting in whatever room Jack Entratter waited in when he was displeased with something that had cost him money. Dean said, "I'll talk to Mancuso." Frank looked up. "Don't, Frank." I said, "Don't. It's my problem." Dean turned around on the stool and looked at Frank directly, not at his reflection. And the difference between looking at a man directly and looking at his reflection is a difference of a specific kind of honesty, the kind that can only happen face to face. You made it in front of 400 people, Dean said. It's not only your problem anymore. Frank had the grace to look at the floor. I'll talk to Mancuso, Dean said. Not about the 40, about tonight, about what he saw. And the 40, you'll handle it quietly, within 2 weeks. And before you do, you call me and tell me your plan. Frank said, you don't have to do this. Dean looked at his oldest friend, sitting on that slightly too small couch. I know that, he said. Jack and Tratter had been running the Sands since 1952, managing the hotel's relationship with the Rat Pack with the patience of a diplomat between two countries that needed each other, but could not behave well in close proximity. He liked Dean Martin. He found Frank Sinatra more difficult. He had been watching from near the sound booth when Frank came out of the wings, and experienced in his own words to a colleague standing beside him, the sensation of a great deal of money becoming temporarily uncertain. The meeting at midnight lasted 12 minutes. Tratter was a practical man. He understood what Dean had done, and what it had cost, and what it had preserved. At the end of 12 minutes, both men understood what the situation would require going forward. Dean Martin's booking fee for the following year would not be renegotiated, a specific and meaningful acknowledgement. Nothing was said about this directly. Nothing needed to be. Now pay attention here, because this is the part that never made it into any version of the story that circulated afterward. Dean found Victor Mancuso in the Copa Room bar at 11:15. The room had cleared of most of its audience. Mancuso was at the bar with one of his men, and when Dean sat down beside him, the other man drifted away with the seamlessness of someone who has spent a career drifting away at the correct moments. Mr. Martin, Mancuso said. Hell of a show tonight. Victor, I want to say something to you, said with respect, and nothing else. All right, what happened up there tonight was between two old friends. It didn't mean anything. You understand what I mean when I say it didn't mean anything. Mancuso was quiet. Then a man grabs another man's microphone in front of 400 people. That's a kind of statement. It's the statement of a man who had a hard week and made a bad decision. Nothing more than that. Dean paused. Frank has a great deal of respect for you. He would want you to know that. What Mancuso said next, second-hand, through Thomas Ricci, was a question about whether Dean was speaking for himself or for someone else. Dean's answer was that he was speaking for himself, as a man who had been on that stage and had a particular investment in the evening being remembered a certain way. Mancuso studied him for a long moment. You're a class act, Mr. Martin. I try, Dean said. Frank's lucky to have you. We're all lucky to have each other, Dean said. That's the whole thing, Victor. That's what it comes down to. He finished his drink, shook Mancuso's hand, and walked out into the corridor, toward the hotel lobby. He stopped once. Briefly, outside the bar, he put one hand flat against the wall and stood there with his eyes closed, his head slightly bowed. His palm against the cool surface of the plaster was the only visible sign of what the evening had actually required. 1 breath, 2 breaths. Then he straightened up and walked on. Look at what just happened in that corridor. Because most people who heard any version of this story never heard this part. The room had been managed. Mancuso had been managed. Tratter had been managed. Tratter had been managed. And Dean Martin, the man whose smile had not moved, while Frank's hand was on his microphone, the man who had turned a potential disaster into a 20-minute standing ovation, needed 12 seconds alone, with a wall before he could walk forward again. 1 hand, 1 wall, 1 breath. That was the whole of it. Frank Sinatra called Dean Martin the following morning at 10 o'clock. It was early for Frank. Frank rarely surfaced before noon, and the earliness was itself a statement. Dean picked up on the second ring. "I talked to Mancuso," Dean said, before Frank could speak. A pause on the line. "How'd it go?" "Fine." "Dean." "It went fine, Frank." Another pause. "The 40. I'll have it handled by the end of the month." "Good. I mean it." "I know you do." Dean was quiet for a moment. "Get some sleep." "Yeah," Frank said. "Hey, Dean." "Yeah. What you did last night, getting me up there, getting the room laughing. It was a good show," Dean said. "You were terrific up there. You always are." "That's not what I'm talking about." Dean was quiet. "I know what it cost," Frank said. And Dean Martin, who had spent 30 years building a persona around the idea that nothing cost him anything, that he was the most relaxed man in any room, that the world slid off him like water off a well-cut tuxedo, said, "Get some sleep, Frank." He hung up. He sat for a moment by the phone. Then he got up and went to get some breakfast. He did not think about the previous evening in any prolonged way. Dean Martin had learned early in his life that the things that have already happened are finished. The only productive relationship you can have with a finished thing is to leave it behind you and walk toward whatever comes next. There is a thing that the people who were in that room on that Thursday evening would say in later years when the story came up. They would say, "Dean Martin was the coolest man who ever stood on a stage. He never flinched, not once. The smile never moved." And all of this was true. What they could not say, because they did not see it, was the 12 seconds in the corridor, outside the Copa Room bar, where a man put his hand against a wall and closed his eyes, because he needed to feel something solid for a moment before he could walk forward again. That was the true thing. The smile was true too. Real, not manufactured. His ease was real. His ability to find the steady ground in a room that had lost its balance was real. None of it was performance in the dishonest sense of that word. But class, real class, the kind that costs something, is not the absence of the difficulty. It is the decision to carry the difficulty in a way that does not make it someone else's burden. One look, one breath, one choice. Dean Martin had made that decision so many times in so many rooms that it had become invisible even to the people standing next to him. Wait. Here is the thing about invisible strength. The people who benefit from it most are often the last to understand what it required. Frank understood. Eventually, he understood it on that phone call the following morning, when he said, "I know what it cost," and Dean refused to confirm it. That refusal was its own kind of generosity. Estelle Carver drove home with her husband Raymond, quiet for most of the drive, the way she was quiet after seeing something performed with exceptional skill. Finally, near the end of the drive, she said, "Did you see his hand?" "Whose hand?" Raymond said. "Dean's." When Frank grabbed the mic, his other hand went into his pocket. Raymond thought about this. "Is that good?" "It's everything," Estelle said. "That's the whole thing right there. A man's first instinct, when something goes wrong, tells you who he is." His hand went into his pocket. They drove the rest of the way home in silence. Estelle Carver did not tell this story again for 11 years, until a student asked about stage presence and what it actually means to be unflappable. She sat down on the piano bench and said, "It doesn't mean you're not feeling it. It means you've made a decision about what to do with it." There is no recording of the evening. A television broadcast had been in progress, but the portion with Frank's appearance was not included in the final edit. The network's log recorded simply "production decision," a call made by a producer named William Farber, who understood that there was only one version of the evening that served everyone's interests, and that version required that the cameras had been looking somewhere else. So there is no film. There is only the testimony of the people who were present, filtered through memory and time. And there is the story that Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra never publicly told. The story that existed only in the 12-second version Dean had enacted in the corridor, hand flat against the wall, eyes closed, the cool surface of the plaster against his palm. Remember the smile that didn't move. Remember the hand in the pocket. Remember the corridor, because those three things together are the whole man, not the performances, not the records, not the television show, just a man who knew what was required of him and did it without making anyone watch him do it. 30 million people watched that broadcast. They saw Dean Martin perform with his customary ease. They saw Frank Sinatra appear for what the announcer described as an unscheduled but welcome guest spot. They saw two old friends on a stage together, and it was good to see, the way it is always good to see men who have known each other a long time and have arrived at the particular ease of that knowledge. They did not see the microphone. They did not see the hand in the pocket. They did not see the dressing room, or the bar, or the corridor, or the conversation at midnight, or the phone call in the morning. They saw the performance. The performance was real, but it was the smallest part of what had actually happened. Dean Martin never spoke about it publicly, which was characteristic. He rarely spoke publicly about anything that mattered to him, which is perhaps why so many people thought nothing much mattered to him, which is perhaps the greatest and most successful performance of his career. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. And if you want to hear about the night a year later when the situation reversed itself, when it was Dean who needed the steady hand, and Frank who had to decide in a fraction of a second what kind of friend he was going to be, tell me in the comments. Some rooms hold more than one story.